us, on behalf of the Sandbox Center team, welcome to our Experts in Residence session, EIR for short, the legal brief with Barriston Law. For those who haven't been acquainted with me, I'm Mackenzie. I'm one of the 6 members of the Sandbox team. The Sandbox is located downtown Barrie and online to connect people and their ideas to business resources on their journey to success. With a wild start to 2021 and much confusion as it relates to the current state of our province, today we're super thrilled to have experts join us to help answer some very important questions that I know many of you will have to ask. Joining us today is Josh Valler, Senior Associate at Barriston Law, along with special guest Janice Leroux of HR Performance and Results, and Barrie-Innisfil MPP Andrea Khanjin, to discuss what the new restrictions mean for you and your business. And of course, a big thank you and shout out to our sponsor, Barriston Law, for delivering today's session.
All right, thank you, Mackenzie, and thank you to the Sandbox for putting on this webinar. It's a year ago, I didn't think in January 2021 we would be in this spot. I don't think anyone did. So thank you immensely to the Sandbox group for putting on these webinars. I know they've been a lot of help to local businesses in the community. So, and the one thing I did know is we may need to change my headshot to reflect the COVID cuts going forward. So thanks, Jacqueline. I didn't have to go back to that and remind me of how far we've come. So why don't we get started in kind of talking about the changes through the provincial state of emergency that came out on January 12th, 2021, or last week. So as many of you know, the government of Ontario declared a second provincial state of emergency effective January 12th, 2021. This essentially allows the province to make new emergency orders under the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. As such, Ontario has introduced a stay-at-home order, and that was the one that made the big news, and a regulation amending the existing shutdown order. The order and regulation aim to reduce the number of daily contacts outside of one's immediate household as of January 14th, 2021. And the measures enacted under the order and state of emergency will be in place for at least 28 days until February 11th, 2021. But it's important to note that this is subject to change should the numbers continue to rise and the emergency continues to be in place in Ontario. So just Andrea and Janice, perhaps before we move on to the next slide, if you have anything that you want to add as we go through the slides, feel free to chime in or pop up just to kind of walk it through from your perspective, anything that you think is important for the viewers to know.
Thank you, Josh. If I just jump in briefly on what you can and can't do. Just for those, I know there's a lot of when you saw the notice about staying at home, and people are often asking, what does that mean? Like, can I just not go outside of my home aside from groceries? And so what it really translates to is, for our cafes and our food vendors, they can still stay open, but they can only do takeout like they have the whole time. And of course, curbside delivery. So if you're going in to their like small little area where you're doing the transaction and paying for your coffee or your sandwich, you can still do that. That's still considered food. It's still fairly essential for those who are busy, who need to pick up meals. So that, being able to go out, get food, beverages, or any medication, that's still essential, as well as if you have to support your loved ones in the community, if you have someone who's isolated and you're the primary caretaker, for example, those who have to go visit a long-term care home because they're primary caregiver, you can still leave your home to be able to do that. And of course, if you're leaving to go pick up curbside delivery somewhere for supporting a local business, then that's certainly possible. And likewise, on the flip side of that, if you're a local business, you can still sell your product via curbside or online. The big differentiator there is you used to be able to do the payment transaction by curbside, and now it's encouraged that you have people pay up front whether they pay online, and then they pick up the product. And so that's the big differentiator now going into this current lockdown.
Andrea, thanks for going through those, or that effective summary of what's in place. So as Andrea mentioned, their individuals are required to remain in their places of residence unless leaving for a permitted purpose, an activity pursuant to the order. And Andrea outlined what exactly those permitted purposes would be. Just to highlight too, outdoor events are limited to gatherings of 5 people, still maintaining social distancing. All those who may work from home must do so and be permitted to do so by their employer, unless the nature of the work requires them to be on site at the workplace. So this does not apply to any government or any person publicly funded organization that delivers or supports government operations and services, including the healthcare sector. So everyone in a facility that is open to the public, though, must maintain physical distance from others of at least 2 meters, except from their caregiver or other member of their household. So the middle point there about all those who may work from home must do so and be permitted to do so, unless the nature of their work requires them to be on site at the workplace. That's the key. And I think we're seeing a lot of employers confused as to what does that exactly mean? What makes someone essential to the workplace, and what happens if the Ministry of Labor disagrees with them, or if the employee disagrees with them. So I know from my conversations over the last couple of days with Janice, that this is something that her and I have experienced with our employer clients. Janice, I don't know if you just want to go through kind of what your experience has been and sort of the advice that you've been giving to your clients.
For sure. Thank you, Josh. What we've been recommending is that all employers literally sit down and actually prepare a list. We actually had sent out a document that they could use where they can populate a list of basically the occupations, the names of the employees in those occupations, and put next to each of those names and occupations the reasons why they have to remain on site, or if those employees are working from home. So we've had several conversations since the order was released last week with the Ministry of Labor, both with regional program coordinators as well as with inspectors. And they have all certainly reiterated that when they go into a workplace, they're going to want to hear and see the justification why employers have chosen to keep some staff on site. And so, it could be a one-page document depending on the size of your business. The last Ministry of Labor inspector I spoke to, he did say he wants to see the names of the individuals beside the occupation. And it could be a quick bullet form, as in, Josh Valler, CEO of the company, managerial oversight, needs to sign checks, and will work from home when necessary. So, I think that is critical, Josh, in terms of getting employers should be prepared for Ministry of Labor inspectors or bylaw officers, is what we've been told, knocking on their doors. And then in addition to that, having all of their COVID-related policies, all their training records and everything ready for the Ministry of Labor if they do show up.
Yeah, and that's really important too. And I think a big thing that employers want to do is talk to their employees and determine, how does the employee feel? Does the employee, by no means is this mandatory on the employer or restrict the employer and saying it. Just say your employee says that they don't feel they're essential. That doesn't require for you to treat them as essential or not essential rather. But having that communication with them too, so that you can ensure that you're both on the same page. Because if there's a huge disagreement up front with the employee as to whether or not they're essential and need to remain at the workplace or attend at the workplace, the risk of being reported to the Ministry of Labor does go up. So you want to ensure that there's no sort of ambiguity between you and the employee with respect to what their job description is, and how that employee is essential at the workplace, and the reason and the rationale as to why. So following Janice's steps that she's outlined there should clear a lot of or clarify the situation for a lot of employers and employees. And it does show transparency with the Ministry of Labor as well. I don't know, Andrea, if you have anything that you want to add to that.
Oh, it's pretty straightforward. You've got it.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so some new limits and measures in place. Every person in the premises of a business or organization must wear a mask or face covering that covers their mouth, nose, and chin when indoors. Although businesses have been subject to face covering obligations in the past, the amendment places a corresponding obligation on individuals attending at the business to ensure that they comply with the requirements. And speaking for Barriston, we've for a while now we've had a policy in place where employees are required to wear their masks when they're at the office if they're not at their workstation. In terms of how does this change things for employers, a lot of the questions that I've been getting, Andrea and Janice, from employer clients are, what happens if my employee is at their desk? Do they have to wear a mask there? The local health unit seems to indicate that you don't, but is there any best practices that you both have been given to, Andrea, to your constituents, and Janice to your clients?
Well, I can jump in first, Andrea. So what, certainly, again, being involved with a lot of Ministry of Labor inspections, as long as the physical distancing is maintained, like, I think you got to look at your policies, review them again, because although they may not have to wear them sitting at their desk in in an office, if someone enters into the office and may come approach the desk in close proximity, then it is advisable to definitely require someone, both parties, like Josh, if you're sitting at your desk and you have a legal assistant come into your office, then that's when the mask should be worn as well. Yeah.
And what I will add is just something we put in place in my office. Obviously, my office scenario is very different from many others, but when we were going through the color coded system, part of it was by the time you get to orange and red zone, there was a part of that framework that said come up with an office plan. And I know everyone is busy and everyone's resources are different, but for what I've seen talking to other businesses is those who had followed that particular bullet on the framework and they had prepared an office plan, they were going into this lockdown and the stay-at-home order in way better shape because they had taken the time to sort of brief up their staff. Hey, this is what happens if we're in red. Here's what happens if we're in lockdown. And as soon as that's announced, they know, okay, this is what the staff need to do. So when it came to things like masking, we knew that by the time we get to a certain color, and even if we're in lockdown, masks need to be worn. And so what we've done in terms of best practices and what we've got from public health as well is it's almost like the restaurant guidelines when we were able to be in them. So when you're at your table for a restaurant, you had your mask off, but as soon as you were to leave your table to go do something, you'd have to put it back on. And so that's a lot of what offices are doing. Having said that, and Janice touched on it, it's if someone is in too close proximity of your desk. So again, this is a public health lens, not so much a politician lens, but know that every time you're speaking, like even if I'm speaking now, there's small particular matters that are coming out, even though you can't see them, and so they have a way to travel. And so the problem being there is if someone is coming up to your desk, you're not wearing your mask because you're sitting, it doesn't mean your particular matter isn't moving, right? Like if you're talking, it means it's moving. So in that situation, even if you have the capacity to put up, what do you call it? You have those barriers, like the clear shields. Those often help too for that purpose. But like was said, if you do wear a mask, if you're cognizant, as soon as someone gets too close and you're about to speak and you're going to be letting out those droplets or what have you, to put that mask on. And there's a great video that one of a doctor had published that actually does show you how much does transpire. So just to be cognizant of your colleagues to keep them safe. And someone had asked about, what if they have an exemption? And certainly, face shield, screen, all of those things are good alternatives, but you should certainly talk with public health in terms of if that employee has an exemption, what do they do in the office? How are they exposing others? And then public health can give you some really good direction there in terms of keeping that individual safe and the rest of the staff and the team.
Thanks, Andrea and Janice. And I know I've been talking with some clients as well who, because they've mandated a lot of their employees to work from home where possible, the employees who do have to attend at the office move from their shared workspaces or open workspaces to some of the vacant offices. And that's, just getting creative with your office space can also protect your employees and customers as well. But certainly, if I think the good rule of thumb is if you are not sitting at a confined space and you are talking with individuals or colleagues, certainly put on a mask to protect not only yourself, but your colleagues as well. So moving on to enforcement measures, if a police officer or other provincial offences officer has probable and reasonable grounds to believe an individual has committed an offence pursuant to the EMCPA, that individual will be required to provide their correct name, address, and date of birth upon request. An officer who believes an organized public event or other gathering is occurring counter to the maximum attendance numbers as prescribed by the emergency order may order a premises to temporarily close. An officer may order an individual attending a prohibited event to leave. So I think maybe Andrea, you can talk on the impetus of this, but I understand that some of the enforcement measures were put in place as a result of people not complying with the social gathering obligations or restrictions rather. So in that vein, we kind of understand what's going on. But in terms of enforcement measures, when it comes to employers and employees, what can employers expect? What can employees expect? Just say they're traveling to work. I understand that there was an article and Premier Ford said that, the police officers will not have the authority just to randomly pull over individuals and ask them where they're going. But in terms of, if they're pulled over for another reason, they can ask. So what protections should employers and employees have in place to ensure that, that they're able to comply with these enforcement measures, and what steps they need to take to protect themselves if they are investigated?
Right. I mean, so I would, I mean, every case is very specific, but I would just, in terms of talking in generalities is, if you're having second guesses about doing something and you're not sure if it's safe, it's likely that you probably shouldn't be doing it, if that's what if your first instinct is. But generally, the new enforcement rules that were put in place there because there was a lot of non-compliance, and we're seeing this now even with some retail locations that are being inspected over the next few weeks, just to ensure that they're keeping customers safe as well, to even that playing field. But certainly, if someone does pull you over and asks you questions on compliance, I mean, if you're following the rules, you have nothing to be worried about. It's more so if you're not following the rules, then this is where Josh, you come in as the lawyer to give the legal advice, which is certainly not my place as your local representative. But generally, that's why we try to tell people what you can leave your home for. Kind of practice common sense with that. It's understandable that if you own a store, that you do need to go into your store to be able to do inventory and to be able to operate curbside. And that's certainly a reasonable way to be on the road and to be at your workplace. That's certainly, and that's within the guidelines, and it's within that presentation that tells you what you're able to do. So if you're going there to do that, certainly also there's the accounting part of things. A lot of people have various paperwork they've got to fill in. Right now it's tax season, and so a lot of that stuff can't necessarily always be done at home. So that's obviously a reasonable endeavor, and you can explain that to the officer there. But even if you get a ticket, certainly there's the ability to be able to go to court and explain what you were doing versus why the ticket was drafted. And certainly if there's something that was misdone, that's your opportunity to do and make your case there.
Okay. And thank you, Andrea. And Janice, just before I have you jump in too, I want to ask another question that perhaps you guys can explain your experiences with, and certainly this is a question I get. If they're a small business owner and they have a shop and they work alone in that shop, and they've had orders online and whatnot, is that small business owner permitted to go to their shop and fulfill those orders that were made online, as long as they're not inviting members of the general public or other employees into the business, even if technically they're not considered to be an essential service?
So you're saying even if they're not an essential service? Because all the stores right now, they can still operate as like if they have curbside delivery. So yeah, we often have, there's quite a few small business clients that are not just going in for curbside delivery, but they've got other business activities that they need to complete, from a finance perspective. Maybe their files are on site, et cetera, et cetera.
So what I would just add to that, to Janice's comments, is I'll just bring up the 8 p.m. closure. And so in that situation, if you are a storefront or a retailer, or you're a business that is doing curbside, technically you're not allowed to do curbside past 8 p.m. But obviously there's a lot of other work that has to be done after you do curbside. There may be paperwork, there might be other orders or what have you that you need to just fill while you're at the store. So as long as you're done the physical curbside collection part by 8 o'clock, so that what that means is there's no more customers actually coming to your curb and picking up product, but you happen to be in your retail space at 8:30 still, you're not, that's reasonable, because there's all these things you have to do to close up, right? You have to do whatever inventory or close up. And so that's understandable. So if you're in the situation where you're at your store past 8 p.m., but you're not fulfilling, you're not putting stuff up on the curb for pickup, that's deemed acceptable.
Well, and maybe Andrea too, I was going to use a quick example. So let's say personal services, right? They're not an essential service right now. So let's use the example of either, Josh kept talking about his hair, so we can use a hairdresser or a salon or like a spa. You know, often those types of businesses also sell product, right? They sell shampoos, they sell, you know, they sell kits, they sell, you know, if you think about a spa, they sell, masks and things like that. So maybe that in that example, Andrea, like those individuals, those business owners, they could go in. It's still curbside pickup. Say, you know, one of their patrons wants to order a facial mask, and they can purchase that. That's still permitted. They're not performing the facial, but they're selling a product, because part of their business is retail and part of their business is personal services. Correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Perfect. So moving on to Stay Safe All Day. The Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development has launched a new campaign, Stay Safe All Day. So this is focusing on inspections, which will focus on high-risk workplaces such as warehouses, distribution centers, construction projects, long-term care homes, grocery stores, and workplaces with reported COVID-19 outbreaks. The province will be increasing enforcement for companies and individuals in this respect. Provincial offences officers have the authority to issue tickets or temporarily close companies, business operators, and employers for not enforcing the provincial requirement. So, I mean, Andrea, can you just kind of let us know what led to this initiative and what the spirit and the intent is from the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the case count is certainly one of them. And of course, the spike we have in deaths because of COVID, and a big part of it is it's the whole the whole community sort of involved in cooling down the cases and helping out the outbreaks that we have, be they in a hospital or long-term care home. The reason being is now what we know in this wave 2 of this virus is it is very much community spread, and there's certain variants of this virus that are very contagious. So that brings us to the Stay Safe All Day. Is if those workplaces aren't doing what their at least minimum requirement is, it means that those employees, not only are they being exposed unsafely, but now they're out in the community, they're out in their house. And if someone, is a caregiver, for example, in their home, and is now going to a long-term care home or a seniors home or, hospital, they're now a spreader. And so that's the reality we're dealing with, where we can't just isolate this in areas where we know it's more prone. The reality now is it's actually within the entire community. It's quite widespread, which is why the case numbers are so high. So the intent here is to make sure that our workplaces are not a huge place for outbreaks, and if they are, we get to the root of them right away. And a big part of this is trying to, for example, there was an article recently about the GTA and how many businesses were not compliant with the rules. And that doesn't bode well for our community, for example, because there's a lot of business owners here that are doing safe businesses. But when governments have to make a blanket policy in the interest of everyone's health, these are the things that obviously come to mind. And so step number 1 in defense is having these labor officers launch the Stay Safe All Day, so we have extra inspections of these places, because they're places where there's a lot of employees at once. I mean, Josh has some listed there, warehouses and distribution centers. And because of the vast volume of people that work there might be some limits, there's distancing, but regardless, as those individuals are going back into the community, and we want to make sure they're not spreading it, and that their employer is doing everything they can to keep their employees healthy, so the whole community is healthy. And so unfortunately, there are people who've been bad actors, and it's been reported all throughout media. And a big part of that, media campaign is also to warn other employees that, this is serious. And by you doing the actions you're doing means we have way more people healthy, more seniors that are living a longer life, and hospitals that aren't at the brink of exhaustion.
Thanks, Andrea. I don't know, Janice, if you have anything you want to add to that, or if you want to move on to the next slide.
Nope, that's good.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrea. So an important question, but I think we've gotten some clarity over the last few days, is what is considered an essential trip? So the provincial definition of essential trips is accessing goods and services necessary for a person's health, safety, and well-being. Ontario and the Premier have advised that it cannot determine what is essential for every person in this province due to the unique circumstances, as Andrea alluded to. But essential trips do include food, healthcare services, including medication, exercise, or work, where someone's job cannot be done at home. Andrea, I know that earlier in this presentation you mentioned that the basic rule of common sense applies, If it seems like something that you shouldn't be doing or something that's not really essential, then perhaps you shouldn't be doing that in the first place, and it's something that you should avoid and stay at home. So I don't know, Janice or Andrea, if there's anything you want to add to this or anything that you feel our viewers should consider when determining whether or not something's an essential trip.
The only thing I want to add, I'm not sure if it's completely tied back to this, other than like if as an employer you require, for example, technicians that are on the road traveling in companies' vehicles, it's been made very clear to us that you should be, if it's customary to have 2 people in a vehicle, then you need to make sure you're following the proper health precautions. And it is advisable to certainly not have 2 people at this time, traveling in a company vehicle.
Yeah, and that seems like it would be common sense. And if at all possible to avoid, it seems like common sense, but it is a very valid question too, because if you require 2 people on the site, but you only have 1 company vehicle, what do you do then? Do you pay mileage to the other employee? There's always workarounds and possible solutions. But I understand that it is a concern that's visited, especially in the construction industry, Janice. I don't know if that's where the majority of your questions are coming from.
Yeah, and it's mask wearing. It's not actually just, it's quite a few other different types of industry sectors too as well. Like it could be in mechanical, it could be in, any industry that employs trades that require them to travel to other locations. So mask wearing, windows down, it's not enough fresh air coming into the vehicle. But at this time, we've been advised that certainly, really revisit whether or not 2 people need to be in that company vehicle.
Yeah, and proper screening processes too before you even get in the vehicle or show up to work, right? Determining whether or not someone's exhibiting any symptoms. So it requires, honesty from the part of the employee too, to show that, if they're not feeling well, stay at home, and stop the spread, which is so important right now, especially as the numbers continue to go up. I don't know if Andrea, if you have anything you want to add to that, or Janice's comments.
I was, but you actually ended up saying everything that needed to be said.
Okay, perfect. So who should work from home? Employers are being asked to use their judgment, and I think our last conversation ties in nicely with this. Anyone who can work from home must now do so. And I note that I have my sign right behind me at home. Andrea, it looks like you're from home as well. Janice, I don't know where you're working from, but it looks like from home as well. I know it's really tough for some employees to be able to rationalize that, and especially right now, as we've been at home for about a year now. We're getting close to a year, and it's tough for employers to have that connection with their employees and provide direction or assistance in determining who needs to be at the office and who can be at home. And so, while the province is asked to use their the employers to use their judgment, sometimes there's a little bit of guidance that's required to help with that and to help employers to determine, okay, who is actually essential and who do you just want to be there? Because who needs to be there and who wants to be there? And to do that requires a variety of different steps. And before the call, Janice and I were kind of bantering back and forth about what some of those steps may be. And the consequences for failing to identify properly who should be at home and who should be at the office could result in a complaint to the Ministry of Labor, a health and safety complaint rather, if the employee feels that they should be able to work from home but have not been permitted to do so, and there can be associated fines with that. So Janice, you had a very clear outline as to what the employers should do in making that determination, and not only making that determination, but being able to justify that determination to both the employee and to the Ministry of Labor should it come to that. Do you want to walk us through that?
Yeah, so I maybe just to kind of build on what I had mentioned previously is I really do encourage everyone to kind of, sit down, really give some thought to, who should be on site and who can actually, perform all of their responsibilities from working from home. And, for those individuals where, they rely on it's a paper-based process, because we have a lot of companies where their processes aren't they're not set up to manage it virtually. And so if you are able to, if you are in the position to invest in technology or any other kind of software or programs to help support employees working from home, that would be great. But it is pretty clear, the public health measures that were released last week that were updated, it is very clear that the employer is responsible. So the employer is responsible to ensure that anybody that can work from home should be working from home with limited exception. So they use the words limited exception, and the limited exception is if their work is tied to something on site. And so, what we talked about a lot last week, Josh, was just go back through your list and make a determination if there is anyone else that could actually be working from home.
Yeah, and that's really important, and having a dialogue with the employee too.
Yeah,
I think is important to and going back to your job descriptions that you have for the employees, identifying and justifying why that's so important for them to be there, why they're essential for the continued operation of your business. And if you're struggling to come up with a justification as to why they're essential, chances are they're not essential. If you're having a hard time coming up with that reason. So just, take a hard look at it. And, I know some employers are reluctant to have the majority of their workforce working from home because, what happens if you need them at the office at a certain time or at the workplace at that certain time. But just take a hard look at their job descriptions and determine whether or not it is actually essential to your business or if there's a workaround.
Yeah, the only other thing I was going to add, Josh, is it's not all or nothing too. I think everyone who's listening today should look at it through the lens that, maybe it's introducing again a rotating schedule where, someone's working from home 3 days a week, they're on site 2 days a week, and where their work is actually tied to, perform a certain responsibility on site. And so, I think it's all about risk mitigation, right? So, it's looking at it and figuring out how can we minimize the risk for COVID coming into our workplace. And there's lots of different creative solutions you can come up with, but you really just have to kind of really think through what's in the best interest of your business, what's in the best interest of your employees, and ultimately with the ultimate goal of keeping everybody safe at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. And, you want to keep the amount of people at the office low. But I think there's always going to be times where an individual who can work from home most of the time can't work from an office work from home on a specific day because their job requires them to be at the office. And, we have lawyers at our firm that need to be at the office on certain days for certain reasons. Say they have court virtually that requires them to be at the office, but for the most part, they can work from home. So having that communication as to determine when someone should be at home or when someone should be at the office, and relying on the employee to communicate if they are able to work from home, communicate to the employer the days and the reasons why they need to be at the office. So, Andrea, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
I just want to jump in and remind everyone. So at the beginning of this pandemic, one document that was really handy on the Ontario website was basically every office, here's a guidebook of a contingency plan of what you need to do to keep your office safe. And it was a guideline. And so what it did was it encouraged, people in their working environment, if you are, the person who manages your office or is the boss, if you will, to put together a document that says, how you're keeping your employees safe and what cohorting are you doing, right? So just, going back to, those best practices that we learned at the beginning, don't throw those all out the window. They're still applicable now, but you can build on them. So if you have in that, like we've done this in my office as a small example, is, going into the lockdown, we did have cohorting. And so that way we're not mixing, certain staff, and that allows us to be better vigilant of who's, working with who, even though there's also masking. So taking all those precautions, but, that advice early on with that document of, put something in writing that shows that you've done everything you should be doing as an employer. And also, asking people if they do have to come in for certain essential issues, you do have, you are tracking who's coming into the office with either the cohorting, or you're also, again, screening, like, Josh was saying earlier too, like all of that. If you are going into the office, have you screened yourself? Do you as the employer have record of that they said that there's no symptoms and now they're going in? So all those things that we sort of learned, just because we're in a stay-at-home order does not mean that those apply. In fact, just double down on some of those things.
Okay, and thanks, Andrea. And I know that we're slowly approaching the 40-minute mark, so we're quickly approaching, I should say. So the next few slides are with respect to industry-specific requirements. So, we can make this slide deck available to all the listeners today. But what I would like to do is move over to updated workplace screening requirements, and then we can get to some questions. I know that there are quite a few questions in the queue. So, and the information that is available with industry-specific sectors is available online through the provincial government websites, and there's an abundance of resources that are available. And once again, we can provide the slide deck following the presentation. So updated workplace screening requirements. Every business and organization must ensure its screening tool for employees and contractors complies with the updated requirements pursuant to the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care's COVID-19 screening tool for businesses and organizations. If a worker travels to multiple locations as part of their shift or workday, the worker's employer holds responsibility for screening, not the receiving business or individual. Workers who seek to enter the receiving business organization may be screened again at that location. The Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health for Ontario has released a screening tool document to be used by businesses and organizations to screen workers, which is available at the link that's contained in the slide. So I don't know, Janice, if you've encountered this or have seen this with or had questions on this particular issue.
Yes, lots. So our recommendation is there's different options you can consider. We are recommending that the screening questionnaires are posted actually on the outside of the employee entrance, because it's a reminder that employees cannot enter into the building if they have any of the symptoms. There are actually some free apps where, for example, construction employer, if they've got multiple people on different sites, there are apps that you can download onto your phones where you can actually go through, check off whether they have symptoms or not. So there's some tracking for that. And then we have been told by public health that it should be documented when you have a positive COVID case in the workplace, and if you have an outbreak, where they're actively filling out and checking off and signing off on the questionnaire on a daily basis. So I think there's more than one option to consider, but the screening's been in place for a number of months. That's not changed. So you should be obviously actively screening everybody going into your workplace, not just employees, but visitors, suppliers, couriers, whoever else is entering into the workplace.
That part is like the contact tracing is really key here. Public health is doing everything they can, but when they're saying that they don't know where a certain person got COVID, it's because they either they went to a business and they didn't write it down. Not that it's certainly not mandated, but you could every business can play their role in this, and if you're able to kind of do that recording, it actually does help the greater public health good, and it gives you that extra level of security for your employees and customers as well.
As always, employers have a responsibility to ensure that the workplace is safe and to take all reasonable precautions to protect workers from illness and/or injury, and that's under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Employers must ensure employees are aware of their entitlement to paid leave and/or income replacement for COVID-19 related absences. Unpaid time under employment standards legislation is in Ontario. Employees are entitled to sick leave, family responsibility leave, family caregiver leave, family medical leave, critical illness leave, and different types of leave entitle employees to leaves of differing duration. Employees have the right to refuse work in conditions that they reasonably believe that will endanger them. COVID-19, as we've discussed in previous webinars, may constitute reasonable grounds for all those but whom it is a foreseeable risk reasonably associated with the job, for example, doctors and nurses. An employee's perception of risk is not always a reasonable cause for refusal, but does warrant investigation. So before we get into the types of different leaves, and that would be in the next slide, Andrea and Janice, why don't we just talk about the OHSA, and the heightened or increased concern that this new strain of COVID provides or has resulted in the emergency order. Is there an increased expectation for employers to take even further steps under the OHSA to provide a safe work environment? That's a question I've been getting quite a bit. Janice, I don't know about you.
As it relates to the new COVID variant, then?
Yeah, COVID generally in the increased numbers, but specifically with the new variants as well.
Well, I think it's important for us to maybe reinforce with everyone that, you know, if an employee contracts COVID-19 in the workplace, then it constitutes an occupational illness under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So there are some reporting requirements as it relates to that. And you know, I think you've got to be very diligent because the Occupational Health and Safety Act requires us to take every reasonable precaution to protect employees. And as it relates to occupational illnesses, and obviously we can't remove COVID, which would be the ideal situation from the workplace, or potentially, you want to make sure that, again, you've got all of the procedures in writing, that you're enforcing them, that people are wearing personal protective equipment properly, because that's also another issue, is mask wearing is a big issue. So, you know, it's just being diligent as it relates to that.
And then to our final slide before we go into the question period, the infectious disease emergency leave. The ESA has been amended to provide job protection for employees not performing the duties of their position for a number of prescribed reasons, including acting in accordance with the legislation, being under medical investigation, supervision, or treatment for COVID-19, having been directed by the employer not to work due to a concern of spreading COVID-19, and providing care or support to a prescribed individual for the reason related to COVID-19, which includes school or child care closure. The IDEL allows for layoffs to last longer than the Standard Employment Standard Act period, after which they would be typically deemed dismissed. However, and there are caveats to that, especially under the common law or case law. However, if the employee has been placed on temporary layoff but has not consented to that layoff in the employment agreement or at the time of layoff, the temporary layoff may be deemed constructive dismissal at common law, regardless of IDEL. So, I mean, as we go into the second lockdown and, you know, increased numbers, I think we may see more and more employees, especially with school closures as well, asking for leave under the infectious disease emergency leave. You know, it's very important to emphasize with employers that this does not constitute grounds for termination. There are specific instances where just say the employee does not qualify for leave under IDEL, then, you know, do you have to grant them an unpaid leave? Technically, no. You don't have to, but the parameters for IDEL are quite large and significant and encompassing. So it is going to be difficult to show that if an employee does want to take the time off for that reason, and it's an unpaid leave, and they feel for whatever reason that they need to, you know, there's limited circumstances in which an employer can ask for proof or any sort of substantiating documents in that respect. So Janice, I don't know, over the last few months, if you've encountered anything along these lines with employees taking the leave that may not necessarily be able to qualify for it, and what advice you've given to employers in those circumstances?
Yeah, I guess the only recommendation I would have, because the vast majority of situations that have arisen recently, all of the reasons pretty much fit into the infectious disease emergency leave. However, we have had a couple of situations where you also have to be mindful of your obligations under the Ontario Human Rights Code. So although the request for the leave may not fit exactly under the infectious disease emergency leave, you might have a duty to accommodate under the Ontario Human Rights Code. So it's just being mindful of that too as well.
I know there are a mix of pre-submitted questions and then questions that were asked today. So the first two kind of go hand in hand. Somebody's asking, what is the recommendation for vaccine encouragement with staff? And then are employees required to have a vaccine when made available, similar to school vaccinations?
So I'm not. This is a great public health question for Dr. Gardner and his team, who are doing an excellent job. But what I will say from what I know is, if you have employees who are have a lot of questions about the vaccine, and maybe if they're a bit hesitant to receive it, there is now a comprehensive COVID website from the province that lays out. It goes through every type of vaccine that's been approved right now, what's in it, what to expect from it, how effective it is. And so, as an employer, you certainly can share that link with them so that they're more comfortable, so that when it is their turn to be vaccinated, they're more comfortable. Where we are now, obviously, you've heard on the news, there's been a bit of retooling of the plant, so there is a slight delay. However, our region can be proud. We're top 4 in terms of regions to get the most amount of vaccines into people's arms, and now we're something like top 2, according to our chief public health officer. I spoke to him yesterday. So we're significantly in good vaccine shape in our area in comparison to others. I would say we're we could always use more. So that's evolving, and there's also many other vaccines that are in the pipe right now to be approved. So I think education is going to be key. Just like the COVID app, it's not mandatory to download to do the contact tracing. Similar with the vaccine, certainly the provincial government has not mandated everyone to have it. There have been comments made in the past of what workplaces decide to do. For example, a comment was made publicly about, if you're getting on an airline, and airlines have to look at their policies in terms of, are they going to require people to have a vaccine? And I equate that to, if you're going to somewhere overseas, some countries require you to have a yellow fever shot. And they will not let you into the country, even if you made it on the plane, unless you have that card that says you have it. And so that is a policy of, say, that country, and likewise other travel clinics. So we're not there yet. Certainly, we don't plan to make it a mandatory anytime soon. So as the employee can pivot onto, if you need what the government has said to date on the vaccine, it's not mandatory, and go from there. But if you have specific questions or your employees are concerned, they can also direct them straight to the public health unit as well, and then any of the publicly available websites to familiarize themselves with the vaccine.
Yeah, and thanks, Andrea. That's great. And from a legal perspective, I think this is going to be something that's hotly litigated for years to come. Because this situation hasn't been tested by the courts. Can an employer unilaterally mandate an employee in order to continue working there to receive a vaccine? If you want to look at the basics of contract law, if you have an employment agreement with the employee that doesn't require them to take all necessary pandemic vaccinations, and I would say that a lot of employment agreements would not include that. The employee could potentially rely on that to say, I don't need to get vaccinated. I never agreed to that in my employment agreement. My employment's not, we never agreed that my employment would be conditional on me receiving a vaccine. Certainly that's an argument you can make. Whether or not you're going to succeed on that on public health grounds is an entirely different story. Other employment agreements would have policy in their employment agreement say the employee is required to comply with all company policies as may be amended at the sole discretion of the employer from time to time. Well, if the employer changes their policy to require vaccinations for them to return to the workplace or continue their employment, there's an argument on the flip side for the employer to say, well, we've changed our policies to protect the public, to protect our customers, to protect our other employees. Then you also want to look at the spirit and the intent of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, where the employer has the obligation to ensure a safe and risk-free work environment for their employees. If part of that is mandating that there's, every employee who wants to return to work receives a vaccination, then that's another consideration as well, right? But this is going to be something that's, I think, going to need some judicial interpretation down the road. Can a employer require you to get a needle stuck in your arm with a vaccine? Yeah, that's tough. I don't think they can unless that you've agreed to it. But where do you go from there as well, right? It's or can the employer require you to continue working from home until you get the vaccine, and they can guarantee a safe and risk-free work environment for their employees. Janice, I mean, this is all subject to debate, and if you ask 10 different lawyers, you get 10 different answers at this point in time. So I'd be curious to see what your insights are, and perhaps you can provide some more context as well.
Yeah, we're starting to get a lot of questions regarding this as well. And it's interesting because when you look at it through the lens of occupational health and safety and the requirement for every employer to take every reasonable precaution to protect employees, and if you look at, if there's any employers here where they have a designated substance program in place, so a designated substance like asbestos and lead and all of that, there actually are medical surveillance programs that employees are signing off on when an employer has a designated substance in the workplace. So I guess my thoughts are it's in some ways it's similar because those employees have to go through regular blood tests and things like that. Although this is a vaccine, it's similar in the sense of protecting that worker from that hazard or that workplace from that hazard. So, I think, yeah, we'll have to see. I think to Andrea's point, right now is a perfect time. It's all about education. So, in addition to sending the link that Andrea had recommended, there's lots of resource materials that you can make available to your employees on an intranet, in the lunchroom. You could do lunch and learn sessions. You can have conversations. Like education, I think, is key around the benefits of vaccinations, right? So
yep.
I think taking that approach at this point would just make a lot of sense.
It's a lot cheaper than the alternative of going through years of litigation, for sure, the education component, because I'm pretty sure, Andrea, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the province is offering that education free of cost. So through the resources available.
That's correct. What I'm going to do is I will share the link I was telling you about, the just the information about the vaccine. So it's the link I'm sharing with people in the group. If you scroll down, it says learn more about vaccine safety. As soon as you click on that, learn more about vaccine safety, it will walk you through the different types of vaccines and what kind of science and medicine they use. So I'm not sure if I can, or maybe if I send this to you, Mackenzie,
Yeah,
and then
for sure.
you can share it with the, I can only share it with the panelists. I'll just, oh, here, panelists and attendees. Okay, there we
I
go,
can include
attendees.
these links in the follow-up email as well to everybody. That will include the pitch deck and a recording of the session as well today. So no worries there.
Thank you.
Perfect. So we'll move on just to the next question here. Somebody is asking, construction has been partially shut down with some sites permitted and some not. For the permitted sites, is there a recommended method to follow to ensure the stakeholders and general public understand why the project is considered essential and there is not a misunderstanding that proceeding is doing something improper or illegal?
Well, and I'm going to direct this maybe unfairly to Andrea, but I think the province did a really good job of outlining in great detail what construction projects are now considered to be essential, with the updated regulations. So, Andrea, I don't know if you want to touch upon that or not.
Yeah, I mean, sure. So that's where the like the public facing the PowerPoint presentation or whatever you want to call it, the enhanced provincial lockdown shutdown guidelines. That's where they're really handy. Like you can go directly on there, see in red print how it's been updated for the construction sector. If it's a document you need to keep printed to show to others, that's what it's a publicly facing document for that reason. And just as Janice was mentioning earlier, just the education piece of allowing the public to know that that's fine. And this is a government document outlining the construction that's perfectly acceptable versus not. We tried to make it a pretty clear line between a lot of residential is acceptable, commercial not as much. It's got a lot of restrictions to it. And so tried to make it pretty clear. But certainly, you can count on that type of document. If there's something else more you need, you can check in with the public health unit. But that particular document for construction, page 23 to 24, is pretty handy to have close by if anyone is giving you a grief of whether or not you should go ahead or not. Because some of the rationale here is probably common sense to the folks in the construction industry, but you're building housing and a roof over people's heads, which is very essential right now. And the other legal part of all of this pandemic, unfortunately, is the evictions piece, right? That's happening. And so having a roof and shelter over your head is key to protecting people against the virus. So that's in terms of the rationale and the health rationale for keeping that sector going.
The next question we have here. Real estate agents have been told by the RECO that they can continue to show homes by appointment only, no open houses. What about private sales? Can someone show their home or cottage to a potential buyer by appointment?
My understanding is that based on Andrea's last point with respect to ensuring that there's a roof over people's heads, the real estate industry as well as the construction industry are essential services with some form of restrictions. I don't think the government can mandate that every sale go through a licensed realtor because individuals are allowed to sell their houses privately. I think in order to do that, though, you need to ensure that you're following the proper protocols in place. I don't know, and Andrea, you could completely contradict me on this, whether or not people are allowed to sell their houses privately. But I think my opinion is that as long as you have the proper processes in place, and you're following all the recommendations that's set out by the local health unit, you know, you could potentially be allowed, but you're also inviting some sort of exposure as well in terms of liability. Just say someone comes to your house and contracts COVID while you're giving, you know, showing your house to them by way of a private sale through appointment. You know, are you liable for that? And, you know, there could be potential liability down the road if they can establish that you didn't follow all the proper safety protocols. Andrea, is there any plans from the provincial government to prohibit private sales? Has that already been done?
So it's a bit of a tricky one, because in that PowerPoint presentation of all the enhancements, it talks about real estate, and it says, you know, you can do a showing, but by appointment only. However, I've had a few inquiries on this in my office, and I've spoken to Andrea about this as well. So, you know, Andrea is recommending that, you know, they don't show too many homes unless it's absolutely necessary, in-person showings. As much as you can do virtual showings, that's what they're recommending as a regulatory body. So if you are a person that's doing private sales, you know, like you could always see what the regulatory body is doing, because they're going to have the most strictest to keep their members safe, and obviously the reputation of their agency. So Aurea, because I had emailed them recently about this, they're basically told me, and I'm just going to read it off of my computer, that they strongly advise their members against them. Basically strongly advise against showings unless it's absolutely necessary, by appointment only, and if it's urgently required. So that's their recommendation. And enforcement of regulations and laws concerning real estate in Ontario are handled by the Real Estate Council of Ontario, so RECO. Obviously, RECO is arm's length organization. So if you are a private sales individual, I would go through the Real Estate Council of Ontario and see what advice they can give to you, because as Josh was saying, the last thing you want to do is find yourself in an area where, you know, someone is enforcing the rules and finds you breaking them. So I would check in with RECO to see what advice is there. And obviously, if you're the one living in your home and you're showing it, that's different from if you have tenants. It gets very complicated when you have tenants, because it's also risking them when you're doing the showing. So again, if it's urgent, you know, obviously you've got to do what you have to do. But when it comes to the showings, just ensure that you are doing that safety, and then maybe check in with some of the other bodies who have best management practices for that. It's a long answer to your question, but I figured you need all the facts.
You know, it's I think, like, it goes back to Jan's point and Andrea's point. Education is key right now, especially with respect to the vaccine.